The room smelled faintly of medicine, damp linen, and old wood, the kind of smell that clung to houses where time itself seemed reluctant to move on. Outside, the late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows in long, pale streaks, settling softly on the bed where his father lay. The man who had once commanded land, labor, and lives now appeared reduced to a fragile outline beneath thin blankets. Each breath came slowly, unevenly, as though his body were negotiating with time for just a few moments more. The son stood nearby, stiff and silent, watching the rise and fall of a chest that had once seemed immovable, eternal. For most of his life, his father had been a figure of unquestioned authority. His word had shaped the household, determined futures, and ended arguments before they began. Even now, in this weakened state, there was a gravity to his presence that filled the room. When his eyes opened, they still carried the sharp awareness of a man who had seen much and ruled much, though now they were clouded with pain and something else, something closer to fear. Not fear of death itself, but of what death would leave unresolved. The son had been summoned urgently, called back from his affairs, with the kind of message that allowed no delay. "Your father is failing," the doctor had said quietly, avoiding the word dying, though it hovered unspoken between them. During the journey home, the son had prepared himself for grief, for responsibility, even for inheritance. What he had not prepared for was confession. When his father finally spoke, his voice was little more than a rasp, yet every word demanded attention. He asked the servants to leave the room, an unusual request, as he had never been shy about speaking openly in front of them. The door closed softly, sealing father and son together in a private space, heavy with unspoken history. The son moved closer, sitting beside the bed, unsure whether to brace himself for instructions or farewells. The old man stared at the ceiling for a long moment, gathering strength. Then he turned his head slowly, fixing his gaze on his son with an intensity that startled him. There was urgency there, but also shame, an emotion the son had rarely seen on his father's face. It was in that look that the son sensed this conversation would not be simple nor brief. His father began by speaking of the past, of years long gone, of decisions made without hesitation or mercy. He spoke not with pride, as he once might have, but with a weary honesty that felt almost foreign. He admitted that there were things he could no longer silence in his mind, memories that returned in the quiet, hours of the night, when even power offered no comfort. The son listened, confused and unsettled, as the man who had shaped his world began dismantling the image he had always known. Then the confession came more clearly. His father spoke of a woman who had lived under their roof, worked their land, and carried their name's burden without ever being granted its protection. A woman who had been enslaved by their family. He did not soften the word, nor did he excuse it. He spoke of cruelty that had been normalized, of obedience that had been mistaken for contentment, and of silence that had been taken as consent. Each sentence seemed to cost him effort, as though admitting these truths physically pained him. The son felt a tightening in his chest. He knew of the woman, of course. Everyone did. She had been there for years, always present yet never acknowledged as anything more than part of the household's machinery. He remembered her quiet movements, her lowered eyes, the way she seemed to make herself small, as if hoping invisibility might grant her safety. Until that moment, he had never truly considered her beyond what she represented in the order of things he had been raised to accept. His father's voice trembled as he spoke of guilt, guilt that had come too late to change much, but not too late to haunt him. He admitted that freeing her had not erased what had been done, nor had it restored what had been taken. Freedom, he said, had come without protection, without apology, without justice. It was a gesture that looked noble on paper, but did little to shield her from the world that still saw her through the lens of her past. The son wanted to interrupt, to ask why he was being told this now, why these words were being dragged into the open at the edge of death. But something in his father's expression stopped him. There was desperation there, a need not just to speak, but to be heard, perhaps forgiven. The old man reached out with a trembling hand, gripping his son's sleeve with surprising strength. That was when he made the request. He said it plainly, without poetry or hesitation, as though clarity itself were an act of penance. He asked his son to marry the woman they had once enslaved, not as a gesture for society, not as a hidden arrangement, but as a lawful public union. He framed it as a duty, a moral obligation that could outlive him and perhaps balance a lifetime of wrongdoing. In his mind, marriage was not only a bond between two people, but a declaration, a way to force the world, and perhaps himself, to acknowledge her humanity fully. The words fell into the room like a weight the sun felt, as though the air had thickened, pressing against his lungs. He could not immediately respond, could not even form a thought that made sense. Marriage was not a trivial matter. It was tied to lineage, reputation, inheritance, and social order. To marry her would mean dismantling everything he had been taught about status and propriety. It would mean becoming a target of ridicule, rejection, and possibly violence. His father knew this. That was what made the request so unsettling. The old man continued, his voice growing weaker but more urgent. He said he did not ask this lightly. He claimed he had thought about it endlessly, that it was the only path he could see toward making amends that went beyond words or money. He spoke of legacy, not the land or the name, but the moral stain that would otherwise pass unchallenged from one generation to the next. He begged his son not to let that stain remain unaddressed. The son felt anger rise beneath his shock. Why was this burden being placed on him now, at the moment when refusal would feel like cruelty? Why had his father not acted sooner, when he still had strength and influence to face the consequences himself? The request felt less like a gift and more like a sentence, wrapped in the language of redemption. Yet when he looked at his father, truly looked at him, he saw a man stripped of power, clinging to the hope that one final act could give meaning to a life increasingly defined by regret. Tears had gathered in the corners of the old man's eyes, slipping down the creases of his face. The son had never seen him cry before. That image alone shattered something inside him. Silence stretched between them. The ticking of a clock echoed loudly, marking time with cruel indifference. The son knew that whatever he said next would shape not only his future, but the way his father would leave this world. To refuse would be hone, perhaps even reasonable. To agree would be devastating in ways he could not yet fully imagine. His father squeezed his arm again, weaker now, his strength fading with each breath. He whispered that he did not expect love, only commitment. That love, if it ever came, would be a blessing, not a requirement. What mattered was dignity, recognition, and the public breaking of a chain that had bound her life to silence. The son finally spoke, his voice low and strained. He did not say yes immediately. He did not say no either. He asked questions, practical ones, desperate ones, about consequences, about her willingness, about how such a marriage could even be arranged. His father answered as best he could, though it was clear his energy was nearly spent. He insisted that the promise must be made now, while he was still alive to hear it. As the sun dipped lower, casting the room in deeper shadow, the son felt the walls closing in around him. He realized there would be no time to consult others, no space to delay. This was not a decision meant to be debated. It was meant to be sworn. With a heaviness that settled deep into his bones, he finally nodded. He spoke the words slowly, carefully, promising to honor his father's wish. The moment the promise left his lips, he felt its weight lock into place, irreversible and absolute. His father exhaled softly, relief washing over his features, as though a great tension had finally loosened its grip. Not long after, his father drifted into a shallow sleep, the lines of anguish eased, his hand slipping from his son's sleeve. The son remained seated there long after, staring at the man who had just altered the course of his life with a single request. Outside, the evening settled into night, unaware of the promise made within those walls, a promise born from guilt, desperation, and the hope that one act, however late, might read a lifetime. He did not yet know how that promise would unravel, only that it had already begun to claim its cost. She had been free for several years, yet freedom had not arrived the way stories promised. It did not come with celebration or reassurance, nor did it erase the years that lived inside her body. Freedom, for her, was quiet and uncertain, like stepping into an open field after a lifetime spent inside narrow walls and realizing there was nowhere to hide. The world expected gratitude, even joy, but it offered little guidance on how to live afterward. She had learned to survive captivity. Learning how to exist beyond it was something else entirely, Her earliest memories were shaped by routine rather than tenderness. Days measured not by seasons or milestones, but by tasks completed and orders obeyed. She had learned early that silence was safer than questions, and obedience more reliable than hope. Her name had been spoken often, but rarely with kindness. It had been used as a command, a summons, a reminder of ownership. Even after emancipation, hearing it spoken aloud still made her shoulders tense, as if she were bracing for instruction. She carried herself carefully, always aware of the space she occupied. Years of being watched had taught her to move efficiently, to avoid attention, to read moods before words were spoken. Freedom did not immediately loosen those instincts. In public spaces, she still kept her eyes lowered, her posture reserved, her presence unobtrusive. It was not submission anymore, but habit, ingrained so deeply that it felt inseparable from her identity. The town knew her story, or at least the version they preferred to repeat. To them, she was not a woman rebuilding her life. She was a reminder of something they would rather forget or romanticize. Some looked at her with pity, others with suspicion, and a few with open hostility. Freedom had not made her equal in their eyes. It had merely shifted her from property to problem, from something owned to someone uncomfortably present. Work was scarce, and when it came, it was offered with conditions. She was paid less, expected to accept more, and reminded frequently that she should be thankful for whatever she received. Gratitude, she learned, was demanded endlessly, as if freedom were a debt she must spend the rest of her life repaying. Any sign of dissatisfaction was met with thinly veiled warnings. Freedom could be revoked in practice, if not in name. At night, when the world quieted, memories surfaced uninvited. They came not as complete images but as fragments, sounds, sensations, sudden rushes of fear with no clear source. The creak of a door could send her heart racing. Raised voices, even in laughter, made her flinch. Sleep was shallow and restless, filled with dreams where she was running but never moving far enough. Morning brought relief, but also exhaustion, the kind that seeped into her bones. She often wondered who she might have been under different circumstances. The question lingered without answer. There had been no room to explore interests or desires, no encouragement to imagine futures beyond survival. Choices had always been made for her, from the work she performed to the way she dressed, spoke, and even stood. Freedom asked her to choose, but no one had taught her how. When news reached her of the dying man's wish, it came not as a request, but as a rumor, filtered through whispers and sideways glances. At first, she dismissed it as cruelty dressed up as gossip. The idea seemed impossible, absurd even. Marriage was supposed to be a union of mutual regard, yet her life had been defined by imbalance and coercion. The thought that such a bond could involve her felt like another way the world sought to control her narrative. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more certain. People watched her more closely, as though expecting a transformation they could witness and judge. Some seemed amused, others scandalized. Few considered what it meant for her. No one came to ask how she felt, whether she wished it, whether she feared it. Her consent was assumed, or worse, considered irrelevant. Inside her, emotions collided in painful confusion. Fear was the strongest, sharp and immediate. Marriage to the master's son meant returning, in some form, to the place that had defined her captivity. It meant binding her future to a family whose power had once erased her autonomy entirely. Even if the terms were different now, the memory of that imbalance lingered like a shadow she could not escape. There was also anger, quiet but insistent. Anger that her life continued to be shaped by decisions made without her. Anger that redemption for others seemed to require her sacrifice. She wondered why her freedom had not been enough, why she must now become a symbol, a solution to someone else's guilt. The injustice of it settled heavily in her chest. Yet alongside fear and anger there was a fragile thread of something else, possibility perhaps, or hope so cautious it barely dared to name itself. Marriage, she knew, could offer protection in a world that offered her little. It could grant legitimacy, safety, and a voice she had never been allowed. The thought frightened her precisely because it tempted her. Wanting safety felt like weakness, but needing it was undeniable. She thought of the son, not as an abstract figure, but as a man she had observed from a distance for years. He had never been cruel to her, but neither had he challenged the system that bound her. He had benefited from it, quietly and comfortably. She remembered his indifference more clearly than his kindness, and that memory offered little reassurance. Trust did not come easily to her. Too often, kindness had been conditional, withdrawn the moment it became inconvenient. Promises had been made and broken with ease, their consequences borne entirely by her. The idea of placing her future in another's hands felt reckless, almost dangerous. Yet refusing carried its own risks, ones she understood all too well. She spent long hours alone, weighing paths that all seemed to demand something from her. Whatever choice she made would be scrutinized, interpreted, twisted to fit narratives that were never hers to control. Acceptance would brand her opportunistic or submissive. Refusal would mark her ungrateful or defiant. In neither case would she be seen simply as a woman making a decision about her own life. Her body carried the history of what she had endured, even if she rarely spoke of it. Scars, some visible, others not, told stories she could not always articulate. Intimacy was not a neutral concept for her, it was tangled with memory and fear. The idea of marriage brought with it expectations she was not sure she could meet without reopening wounds that had barely begun to close. When she imagined standing beside him, publicly acknowledged as his wife, her feelings were painfully mixed. There was dignity in the idea, but also exposure. Marriage would place her under a spotlight she had spent her life avoiding. It would invite judgment not only of her past, but of her body, her behavior, her worthiness. Every mistake would be magnified, every silence interpreted. She longed, quietly, for a world where her past did not define every interaction, where she could exist without explanation, without carrying the weight of history into every room. That world felt impossibly distant, almost imaginary. The present offered only imperfect choices, each shaped by forces larger than her. In moments of rare honesty with herself, she admitted that she was tired, tired of surviving, tired of being strong, tired of carrying resilience like an obligation. She wanted rest, stability, something resembling peace. Whether marriage could offer that, she did not know. But the longing itself felt dangerous, as if acknowledging it might be used against her. No one asked her what she dreamed of, if she dreamed at all. No one asked whether she loved or feared love, or had given up on it entirely. The world assumed that survival was enough, that freedom alone should satisfy her. They did not see the loneliness that settled into her evenings, the quiet ache of a life lived mostly inside herself. As the possibility of marriage loomed closer, she felt herself standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain. Whatever came next would redefine her again, for better or worse. She knew only that the past would not loosen its grip easily, and that any future offered to her would demand courage she was not sure she still possessed. She was no longer enslaved, but she was not yet unburdened. Her freedom existed in a fragile space between what had been taken and what had yet to be claimed. And as the world prepared to decide her fate once more, she braced herself, knowing that whatever choice lay ahead, it would be hers to endure, even if it was never truly hers to make. The day of the marriage arrived without joy, announced not by bells or laughter, but by an uneasy stillness that settled over the house and the town alike. It felt less like a beginning and more like an event people wished to observe quietly, as one might watch a storm approach from a distance. Preparations were minimal, almost deliberately restrained, as if excess celebration might draw unwanted attention or provoke open disapproval. There were no bright colors, no music drifting through open windows, no sense of anticipation. Everything about the occasion carried the weight of necessity rather than choice. He dressed carefully that morning, his movements deliberate and slow. Each button fastened felt like a confirmation of the path he agreed to follow, a reminder that this was no longer a promise spoken in the shadow of a sickbed, but a commitment about to be sealed in public view. As he looked at his reflection, he searched for certainty and found none. What stared back at him was a man caught between obedience and doubt, burdened by a duty he could neither fully accept nor escape. She prepared herself in another room, assisted by women who spoke softly and avoided her eyes. The dress she wore was simple, chosen more for propriety than beauty. As it rested against her skin, it felt unfamiliar, like a costume worn for a role she had not auditioned for. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the fabric, not from excitement, but from the knowledge that this garment marked another transformation imposed upon her life. Once again, her body was being prepared for a future shaped by others' expectations. When they stood together, the imbalance between them was impossible to ignore, even if no one dared name it aloud. He stood straight, composed, bearing the outward confidence of his position. She stood quietly beside him, her posture careful, her expression controlled. To the onlookers, the scene was shocking enough to inspire whispers, yet restrained enough to allow them to pretend it was acceptable. The ceremony passed quickly, the words spoken with formality but little warmth. The vows felt less like promises exchanged than obligations declared. As they left the room together, now bound by law and custom, neither reached for the other's hand. The absence of that small gesture spoke volumes. They walked side by side, connected by title rather than affection, aware that every step was being measured and judged. The town watched closely, eager to interpret their expressions, their distance, their silence. Whatever meaning people chose to assign to the marriage would spread quickly, regardless of the truth. Inside the household, the shift was immediate yet deeply uncomfortable. She was no longer addressed as she had been before, yet the new title did not bring ease. Servants hesitated when speaking to her, unsure how to navigate the sudden change in her status. Some avoided her entirely, while others watched with curiosity that bordered on resentment. The lines that once defined the household had blurred, but they had not disappeared. They had merely rearranged themselves into new, unfamiliar patterns. He struggled with his role as well. Having fulfilled his promise, he found himself uncertain of what came next. The marriage had not come with instructions on how to build a life together, how to bridge the vast distance between their experiences. He felt watched constantly, not only by the community but by his own conscience. Every interaction with her carried the weight of history, reminding him of privileges he had never earned and wounds he had never suffered. Conversation between them was sparse and cautious. Words felt dangerous, capable of revealing too much or reinforcing the wrong assumptions. When they did speak, it was often about practical matters, spoken in tones that avoided intimacy. He did not know how to approach her without invoking memories he feared reopening. She did not know how to trust gestures that might vanish the moment they became inconvenient. At night, the house felt unbearably quiet. The rooms that now belonged to them both were filled with tension rather than comfort. The expectation of closeness hovered unspoken, heavy and unsettling. For her, the idea of sharing space so intimately awakened memories she worked hard to be buried. For him, the realization that marriage carried responsibilities beyond legality stirred discomfort he was unprepared to confront. Sleep came fitfully to both, fragmented by thoughts neither could voice. Days passed, and the reality of their situation began to settle in. The marriage did not erase the past, it magnified it. Every shared meal, every brief exchange, was colored by the knowledge of what had come before. She wondered constantly whether she was truly seen as a wife or merely as a symbol of atonement. He wondered whether any kindness he showed could ever be free of obligation, or whether it would always feel like repayment for a debt he had inherited. The outside world offered no relief. Visitors came less frequently, and when they did, their politeness felt forced, brittle. Invitations ceased altogether. Business associates found excuses to distance themselves. The marriage had marked him, reshaping his place in society. While he had expected resistance, the extent of it surprised him. The cost of fulfilling his promise revealed itself not all at once, but gradually, through isolation and quiet rejection. For her, the scrutiny was relentless. Her behavior was observed closely, dissected for signs of ambition, manipulation, or inadequacy. Any misstep, no matter how small, was seized upon as evidence that the marriage had been a mistake. She learned quickly that dignity alone would not protect her. She was expected to perform gratitude, humility, and restraint at all times. The burden of representing something larger than herself pressed heavily on her shoulders. Inside, resentment grew alongside guilt and fear. He resented the circumstances that had forced this union, the way his father's desire for redemption had left him to face consequences alone. She resented being cast as the instrument of someone else's conscience. Her life once again is shaped to ease another's burden. Neither spoke these feelings aloud. Silence became their shared language, a fragile truce that allowed daily life to continue without open conflict. Attempts at normalcy felt hollow. They dined together, walked the grounds, exchanged polite remarks. Yet beneath every interaction lay the unspoken truth that this marriage had not been born of mutual choice. She often caught herself wondering what affection might feel like if it were freely given, unshadowed by power or history. He found himself questioning whether love could ever grow in soil so deeply scarred. There were moments, fleeting and uncertain, when connection seemed possible, a shared glance, a quiet understanding during an uncomfortable encounter, a moment of unexpected laughter that startled them both. These instances offered a glimpse of what might have been, had circumstances been different, but just as quickly, doubt extinguished the spark. The weight of expectation, of memory, pressed back in, reminding them of the fragile ground on which they stood. The imbalance between them, though altered, had not vanished. She was legally his equal, yet socially and emotionally vulnerable in ways he was not. He controlled the resources, the reputation, the narrative. She depended on his continued commitment, not just for comfort, but for safety. This reality shaped every decision she made, every word she chose not to speak. Freedom within marriage proved more complicated than freedom outside it. He became increasingly aware of how little he truly understood her. Her silences, once dismissed as shyness, revealed themselves as layers of self-protection. He began to see the cost of the life she had endured, not through stories told, but through what remained unspoken. This awareness brought discomfort rather than clarity. It forced him to confront the limitations of his own empathy, the ways he had benefited from a system that had nearly erased her. The marriage, intended as an act of restitution, exposed wounds rather than healing them. It demanded patience neither had been given time to develop. It asked for trust where trust had been systematically broken. What bound them together was not love, but a promise rooted in guilt and obligation, stretched thin by the realities of daily life. As weeks turned into months, the strain became impossible to ignore. The house felt heavier, its walls holding echoes of unresolved tension. Both began to sense that fulfilling the promise had been only the beginning of a far more complex reckoning. The marriage stood as a testament to intention without understanding, to duty undertaken without regard for the human cost. What neither fully grasped yet was how fragile their arrangement truly was, how easily it could fracture under the weight it carried. The promise had been kept in form, but its spirit remained unsettled, restless. And in that uneasy space between obligation and desire, the seeds of tragedy quietly took root, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough to hold them at bay. The reaction from the community did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, like a slow tightening of a noose, subtle enough at first to be dismissed, then unmistakable in its intent. At the beginning, it took the form of awkward pauses and forced politeness. People who once greeted him warmly now nodded from a distance or pretended not to see him at all. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. Smiles lingered just long enough to appear courteous before dissolving into something colder. For her, the change was immediate and brutal. Eyes followed her wherever she went, weighing her movements, her posture, the tone of her voice. She was no longer invisible, but that attention brought no comfort. It was sharp, intrusive, and often hostile. Whispers trailed behind her like a second shadow, growing louder when she passed, and quieter only when she was out of sight. She felt dissected by rumors that stripped away her humanity and replaced it with speculation. The marriage had unsettled the town's sense of order. It challenged assumptions people relied on to feel secure about their place in the world. Rather than confront their discomfort honestly, many turned it into anger. They spoke of tradition, of propriety, of the natural order of things, using those words as shields to justify cruelty. What they truly feared was the erosion of boundaries they had long accepted without question. He soon discovered that his name, once a source of unquestioned respect, no longer carried the same weight. Business dealings became strained. Contracts were delayed, then quietly abandoned. Partners who had benefited from his family's standing found reasons to withdraw, citing vague concerns or sudden changes in circumstance. The message was clear even when it was not spoken. His choice had consequences, and they would not be borne alone. Public gatherings became unbearable. Invitations stopped arriving, and when they did appear, they came with an unspoken warning. At dinners and social functions, chairs were placed just far enough away to signal disapproval without causing open offense. Conversations veered uncomfortably when he or his wife approached, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than any insult. He began to understand how isolation functioned as a form of punishment, one that required no violence to be effective. For her, hostility was more direct. Some refused to address her at all, as if acknowledging her presence might legitimize the marriage. Others took a different approach, speaking to her with exaggerated politeness that dripped with mockery. There were comments disguised as concern, remarks about knowing one's place, warnings delivered with smiles that never reached the eyes. Each interaction reinforced the truth she already knew. Acceptance was not forthcoming. Religious leaders, who might have offered refuge, instead became another source of judgment. Sermons grew pointed, heavy with references to order, obedience, and divine intention. Though her name was never spoken, the message was unmistakable. She sat among the congregation feeling exposed, her very presence framed as a provocation. Faith, once a quiet source of endurance for her, began to feel like another institution aligned against her. Children learned quickly from the adults around them. They stared openly, whispered without restraint, and asked questions their parents failed to silence. Some repeated slurs they did not fully understand, testing their power. Others laughed nervously, unsure whether fear or curiosity should guide them. Each encounter chipped away at her resolve, reminding her that cruelty often required no deep conviction, only permission. The pressure on their marriage intensified as the outside world closed in. He felt pulled between defensiveness and doubt, anger at the town's cruelty and guilt over the pain his decision had caused her. She felt trapped between the desire to endure and the growing fear that endurance itself was becoming a kind of slow destruction. What little stability they had managed to build began to fracture under the weight of constant scrutiny. Violence, when it came, did not announce itself immediately. It lingered at the edges of possibility, hinted at through threats and warnings. Anonymous notes appeared, slipped under doors or left in places where they would be found without witnesses. The language was crude and deliberate, meant to terrify rather than persuade. He dismissed them at first, unwilling to leave the town capable of going further. She did not. She had learned long ago to recognize danger before it fully revealed itself. The house that was meant to be a refuge began to feel vulnerable. Sounds in the night took on new meaning. A knock after dark sent her heart racing. She began to measure her movements carefully, avoiding unnecessary outings, keeping close to familiar spaces. He noticed the change in her, the way her shoulders tightened, the way she flinched at sudden noises. Guilt settled heavily on him, an unwelcome companion he could not shake. Social rejection turned into economic pressure. Suppliers refused service, citing shortages that never existed before. Workers left without explanation, unwilling to be associated with a household that had become a symbol of controversy. The isolation grew more complete, closing in from all sides. What had once been a thriving estate now felt like a besieged outpost, its walls offering only the illusion of safety. For her, the most painful judgments came wrapped in moral language. She was accused of ambition, of manipulation, of exploiting guilt for personal gain. These accusations ignored the reality of her fear and reduced her survival to strategy. Each claim stripped away another layer of her humanity, transforming her into a caricature that could be easily despised. She wanted to scream at the injustice of it, but experience had taught her the cost of speaking out. He began to realize that no amount of restraint would satisfy their critics. Silence was interpreted as arrogance, politeness as defiance. The more they tried to fade into the background, the more conspicuous they became. The town needed an example, and their marriage provided one. By punishing them, others could reassure themselves that the old boundaries still held power. tension seeped into every aspect of daily life. Minor disagreements between husband and wife took on greater significance, magnified by exhaustion and fear. He struggled to offer reassurance he did not fully feel. She struggled to accept comfort without suspecting it might be temporary. The distance between them, once born of uncertainty, now widened under stress, making genuine connection even harder to sustain. There were moments when he considered leaving, taking her somewhere far from the town's reach. But escape was not simple. His obligations, his remaining resources, the very identity he carried made disappearance impossible. Even if they fled, he feared the stigma would follow them, reshaped but unchanged. She knew this too, though she rarely spoke of it. Freedom, she had learned, was never absolute. As hostility intensified, allies proved scarce. Those who might have spoken in their defense chose silence instead, unwilling to risk their own standing. Sympathy, when it appeared, was offered privately, never publicly. People shook their heads and expressed regret, then returned to their lives untouched. The loneliness of that realization cut deeply. Support withheld out of fear felt almost worse than open condemnation. The marriage, once framed as an act of redemption, became a lightning rod for every unresolved tension within the community. Resentment that had long simmered beneath the surface found an outlet. By focusing anger on them, the town avoided examining its own complicity in the past and its ongoing inequities. Hatred, she realized, was easier than reflection. The threat of open violence grew harder to ignore. Stones were thrown at night, windows shattered, livestock harmed. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed as mischief, yet together they formed a pattern too clear to deny. He confronted local authorities, only to be met with indifference or thinly veiled blame. The message was unmistakable: protection would not be offered. Fear became a constant presence, shaping their days and nights. She slept lightly, listening for sounds that might signal danger. He began carrying the weight of responsibility more acutely, aware that his promise had placed her directly in harm's way. Regret gnawed at him, not for fulfilling the promise, but for underestimating the world's capacity for cruelty. The community's judgment seeped inward, threatening to define how they saw themselves. She fought against the internalized shame that whispered she was at fault, that her existence was an offense. He fought against the growing bitterness that tempted him to see the marriage itself as a mistake rather than the prejudice surrounding it. Both struggled to hold on to a sense of self separate from the roles imposed upon them. By the time the hostility reached its peak, it was clear that the town would not relent. The cruelty had taken on a life of its own, fed by fear, tradition, and the desire to punish deviation. What had begun as whispered disapproval had evolved into something far more dangerous, something that threatened not just their happiness, but their safety and survival. They stood together in the midst of that storm, bound by a promise that now felt both sacred and unbearable. Society's judgment pressed down relentlessly, testing the limits of endurance and resolve. And as the pressure mounted, it became increasingly clear that the forces aligned against them would not be satisfied until something broke, whether it was their marriage, their spirits, or their lives. The breaking point did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It crept closer through exhaustion, through nights spent listening for danger and days spent pretending strength. By the time tragedy finally revealed itself, it felt less like an interruption and more like an inevitable conclusion to a story already weighed down by too much suffering. What surprised them was not that something terrible happened, but how quietly the world seemed to accept it once it did. Fear had become a constant companion, shaping every decision they made. She moved through the house as if it were fragile glass, careful not to draw attention, careful not to provoke. He watched her closely, haunted by the knowledge that his promise, meant to restore dignity, had instead placed her in greater danger. The guilt that followed him everywhere grew heavier each day, an unspoken acknowledgement that good intentions offered little protection against hatred. The first real sign that something was about to give came in the form of silence, not the uneasy silence they had grown accustomed to, but something deeper, more ominous. The threats stopped. The stones no longer struck the windows at night. Even the whispers seemed to fade. At first, he felt a cautious relief, hoping that perhaps the town had finally grown tired of its cruelty. She did not share that hope. Silence, she knew, often preceded harm. She became increasingly withdrawn, her words fewer, her movements slower. The strength that had carried her through years of survival seemed to fray at the edges. She slept even less than before, her dreams haunted by a sense of approaching doom she could not articulate. He noticed the change and tried clumsily to reach her, offering reassurance that sounded hollow even to his own ears. He could not promise safety when the world had made it clear none would be given. The marriage, already strained, began to feel like a closed room with no windows. Their shared suffering did not draw them closer, it magnified the distance between them. Each carried private thoughts they could not bring themselves to voice. She wondered whether agreeing to the marriage had been a mistake, whether survival would have been easier alone. Unbound by expectations and constant scrutiny, he wondered whether keeping his promise had been an act of courage or cowardice. Courage in honoring his father's wish, cowardice in failing to confront the consequences sooner. The tragedy itself unfolded on a night that seemed unremarkable at first. The air was heavy, the sky low and overcast, pressing down on the world. The house was quiet, its inhabitants exhausted by vigilance. When the sound came, a sudden disturbance, sharp and unmistakable, it shattered that fragile calm. Panic surged, instinct overtaking thought. She moved first, driven by fear honed over years of danger. He followed, heart pounding, the weight of responsibility crashing down on him in that instant. What happened next would be recounted in fragments, shaped by rumor and fear. Some said there were voices outside, others claimed there were none. Some insisted it was an accident, others a deliberate act. The truth, like so much else in their lives, became distorted by the narratives people preferred to believe. What remained undeniable was the result, a life altered irrevocably, a promise paid for with blood and loss. When dawn came, it revealed the aftermath with cruel clarity. The house, once a symbol of uneasy refuge, bore the marks of violence. She lay injured, whether by her own desperate attempt to escape, by the actions of others, or by a convergence of fear and chaos no one could fully explain. Her body, already burdened by history, had reached its limit. Survival, which had once seemed an unbreakable instinct, faltered under the weight of unrelenting terror. He sat beside her as the light crept into the room, numb and hollow. The reality of what had happened refused to settle neatly into his mind. Every sound felt distant, every movement unreal. When she opened her eyes briefly, there was no accusation in them, only exhaustion and something like resignation. She did not speak much. Words, after all, had never saved her before. As her condition worsened, the town reacted with a chilling predictability. Sympathy arrived cautiously, filtered through layers of justification and denial. Some expressed regret, careful to distance themselves from responsibility. Others framed the tragedy as an unfortunate but unavoidable outcome, as if suffering were a natural consequence of defying social order. Very few acknowledged the cruelty that had paved the way for this moment. If she died, they would mourn briefly, then move on. If she lived, they would expect gratitude for having survived. Either outcome allowed them to avoid confronting their role. This realization settled heavily on him, a bitter understanding that the promise he had kept had never been welcomed and would never be forgiven. The town had always intended to punish deviation, and now it had done so. In her final days, whether those days ended in death or in a survival that felt eerily close to it. She reflected quietly on her life. She thought of the girl she had been before she understood fear, before survival became her defining skill. She thought of the freedom she had tasted briefly, the hope that had flickered and then dimmed. Marriage, meant to offer protection and dignity, had instead become another chapter in a story defined by endurance rather than choice. She did not blame him in the way he feared she might. Her understanding of power and consequence was too clear for that. She knew that neither of them had truly controlled the forces that shaped their lives. Still, the cost of the promise was undeniable. It had demanded more than either of them could afford to give. When the end came, whether in a quiet passing or in a life forever altered by trauma, it did not feel dramatic or righteous. It felt small, contained, almost private. The world did not stop. The town did not change. Life continued, indifferent to the loss it had helped create. That perhaps was the cruelest truth of all. He buried her or cared for her in silence, depending on the shape tragedy took. In either case, he emerged changed, stripped of illusions about redemption and legacy. The promise he had made had been fulfilled, but it had not delivered salvation. Instead, it exposed the limits of symbolic gestures in a world unwilling to confront its own cruelty. Years later, people would speak of the marriage in hushed tones, framing it as a cautionary tale or a moral curiosity. Some would praise his father's intention, others would condemn the outcome without examining the causes. Rarely would anyone speak her name with the respect it deserved. Her life would be reduced to a footnote in a story about guilt and consequence, rather than recognized as a human experience shaped by resilience and loss. For him, the tragedy became a permanent presence, shaping every choice that followed. He carried the memory of her with him, not as a symbol, but as a reminder of what promises could demand when made without regard for the world they must survive in. He understood, too late, that redemption cannot be achieved by sacrificing another's peace. The promise that began at a deathbed ended not with forgiveness but with grief. It left behind a silence deeper than any threat, heavier than any judgment. And in that silence lingered the truth no one wanted to face, that tragedy was not the result of a single decision, but of a society that chose cruelty over compassion. Again and again, until nothing else remained,